The old ranch house stood silent against the gathering storm, its weathered boards telling stories of bygone days. Inside, Mason Tucker stared at the now yellowed newspaper clipping from 15 years ago. The headline still brought a lump to his throat. Local rancher takes in stranded widow. What the paper never printed was how close he'd come to turning away that night, how near he'd been to losing everything that would give his life meaning. The photograph showed a younger version of himself, standing beside a frail woman whose eyes held both fear and fierce determination. Her hand rested protectively over her swollen belly, while his own shoulders were squared against the winter. Wind. Could one moment of kindness on a bitter winter's night truly change the course of two lives forever? Mason set the newspaper clipping aside and reached into his vest pocket, fingers closing around the familiar weight of his father's gold pocket watch. The timepiece hadn't run in years, its hands frozen at 6:47, but he carried it anyway. His father's last words echoed in his mind. "Time ain't just something that passes, son. It's something you fill." The morning light struggled through frost-etched windows, casting long shadows across the cabin's worn floorboards. Outside, the wind whistled through gaps in the barn's wooden slats, a sound that had become as familiar as his own breathing over the past 20 years. The ranch had been in the Tucker family for 3 generations, though looking at it now, you'd hardly guess its proud history. Mason pushed himself up from the kitchen table, his joints protesting the cold. At 45, he wasn't old, but years of working the land had left their mark. The coffee pot on the wood stove had boiled down to a bitter sludge, much like his thoughts these days. Bills were piling up faster than the snow outside, and the bank's patience was wearing thin. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air bit at his face, and in the distance dark clouds gathered over the mountains. The weather radio had warned of a major storm system moving in, the kind that could make or break a struggling rancher. His small herd of cattle would need to be moved to the sheltered pasture before it hit. Making his way to the barn, Mason nodded to the old bay mare in her stall. Martha had been his father's favorite, and though she was too old for much work, now he couldn't bring himself to part with her. She nickered softly as he passed, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "I know, old girl," he murmured, patting her neck. "Times are lean for all of us." The barn's interior was a testament to better days. Empty stalls that once housed a dozen horses, rusting tools hanging from weathered pegs, and the sweet smell of old hay mingling with decades of memories. Mason had been just a boy when his father taught him to mend tack in here, sitting on upturned buckets while winter storms raged outside. "A man's worth isn't in what he owns," his father would say, working the leather with practiced hands, "but in what he builds, what he maintains." The words had seemed simple then, but they carried a different weight now that Mason stood alone. In the emptying barn, he checked his father's watch again, a habit more than a necessity. The morning was slipping away, and there was work to be done. The forecast promised the storm would hit by nightfall, and he had preparations to make. The ranch might be struggling, but Mason Tucker wasn't one to let circumstances defeat him without a fight. Working methodically, he began preparing for the storm. Each task was performed with the precision of long practice, checking the generator, securing loose equipment, ensuring the cattle would have access to feed and unfrozen water. His movements were those of a man who had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up considerably, driving bitter fingers of cold through every gap in his clothing. The sky had darkened to a threatening grey, and the first few snowflakes were beginning to fall. Mason stood at the fence line, watching his small herd of cattle huddling together against the wind. They were good stock, descended from the prize bulls his grandfather had raised, though the herd was much smaller now. His father would have known what to do in times like these. James Tucker had been a pillar of the community, the kind of rancher. Other men came too for advice. He'd built this place up from nearly nothing, only to watch it begin to slip away in his final years. The cancer had taken him quickly, leaving Mason with a failing ranch and a pocket watch that no longer kept time. "What would you do, Dad?" he muttered into the wind. But the only answer was the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the mountains like a warning. Inside his pocket, the watch seemed to grow heavier. Mason pulled it out one more time, rubbing his thumb over its scratched surface. The engraving on the back was worn but still legible. To James Tucker, time well spent is never wasted. His mother had given it to his father on their 20th anniversary, just 2 years before she passed. The wind was really picking up, now driving the snow sideways. Mason took one last look at the gathering storm before heading back to the cabin. The day's work was done, but something in the air told him this night would bring more than just snow and wind. He couldn't have explained it if asked, but there was a feeling in his bones, the same kind of feeling his father used to get before everything changed. As he crossed the yard, Martha's anxious whinny carried from the barn. The old mare was sensitive to storms, and her instincts were usually right. Mason paused, looking back toward the road that led to town. In the growing darkness, it was already disappearing under a blanket of white. The pocket watch weighed heavy in his vest, a reminder of all he had to lose, and perhaps, though he didn't know it yet, all he had to gain. The storm was coming, and with it, a chance to prove what kind of man time had made him. The bus station in Millbrook was nearly empty when Sarah Mitchell stepped down from the worn steps, one hand steadying herself against the cold metal handrail, the other protectively, cradling her swollen belly. In her coat pocket, a crumpled letter seemed to burn against her skin. The last words her husband would ever write to her, penned just before he drove his truck off the canyon road with their life savings and another woman's lipstick on his collar. "Gone to make our fortune," he'd written. "Don't try to find me." The postmark was from Las Vegas, and the paper still carried the faint scent of cigarette smoke and broken promises. The letter had arrived 3 days after the highway patrol found his truck, and 2 weeks after Sarah had discovered she was carrying his child. The wind cut through her thin wool coat like knives, and the first heavy flakes of snow were starting to fall. The station attendant was already locking up, casting her a mix of pity and impatience. "Last bus west won't be through till morning, ma'am," he called out. "Storm's coming in fast. You ought to find somewhere warm to wait it out." But Sarah knew there was nowhere to go. The little money she had left wouldn't cover a motel room, and her pride wouldn't let her call the women's shelter in the city. She'd just fled. Her own family was 3 states away, and they'd warned her about Thomas Mitchell from the start. Going back now would mean facing their knowing looks, their whispered, "We told you so's." She pulled her coat tighter and started walking. The town's main street was already shuttering for the storm, shopkeepers hurrying home to warm hearths and hot suppers. The neon open signs blinked out one by one, like stars disappearing behind storm clouds. Her feet ached in boots not made for walking, and the baby moved restlessly inside her. "Just a little further, little one," she whispered, though she had no destination in mind. The wind was picking up, driving the snow harder now, and Sarah could barely see more than a few yards ahead. The letter in her pocket seemed heavier with each step, weighted down with all the dreams that had died with it. She'd met Thomas at a rodeo 3 years ago, drawn in by his easy smile and grand plans. He was going to build them an empire, he said, starting with his father's small ranch. But the empire had crumbled under the weight of gambling debts and empty promises, leaving Sarah alone with nothing but a dead man's child and a letter full of lies. The town's lights were fading behind her now as she followed the county road. Her grandmother had always told her that God never closed a door without opening a window. But right now all Sarah could see were walls closing in. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if reminding her that she wasn't truly alone. A wooden sign loomed out of the swirling snow. Tucker Ranch, 3 miles. Sarah had passed it on the bus coming in, barely noting the weathered boards and faded paint. Now she studied it like a lifeline. 3 miles wasn't so far, even in this weather. Maybe there would be a barn, a shelter of some kind, where she could wait out the worst of the storm. The wind howled across the open fields, and Sarah tucked her chin against her chest, pushing forward. The letter crinkled with each step, and suddenly she couldn't bear its weight anymore. Pulling it from her pocket, she read it one last time by the dim light of the growing storm. "My dearest Sarah," it began, though there was nothing dear about the selfish words that followed. Thomas had always been good with words, right up until the end. She'd built her whole life around those words, and now they were as empty as the promises they held. With trembling fingers, she tore the letter into tiny pieces, letting them scatter in the wind like confetti. The baby moved again, and this time Sarah managed a small smile. "That's right, little one. We're done with the past. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The snow was falling harder now, the wind driving it sideways. Sarah's feet were numb, and her back ached fiercely, but she kept moving. One step, then another. The ranch sign had promised shelter, and she had nowhere else to go. Through the curtain of white, she caught glimpses of fence posts marking the way. They stood like sentinels in the gathering dark, guiding her forward. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "When you're lost, child, just keep moving. The good Lord will show you where you need to be." The sound of livestock carried faintly through the storm. The low mooing of cattle, the nervous whicker of horses. Sarah followed the sounds, her frozen fingers wrapped protectively around her middle. The baby was her compass now, leading her toward whatever future awaited them both. A shape emerged from the swirling snow, the dark bulk of a barn, its weathered walls promising at least some shelter from the storm. Beyond it, she could make out the faint glow of lights from a house. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She'd sworn she'd never depend on the kindness of strangers again, not after Thomas. But the storm was worsening, and the baby had to come first now. Everything she did, every choice she made, would be for this new life growing inside her. With the torn pieces of Thomas's letter scattered behind her in the snow, Sarah Mitchell took a deep breath and stepped forward into whatever fate awaited her at the Tucker Ranch. Mason was checking the barn doors one final time when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the howling wind. Martha stomped restlessly in her stall, and there it was again, the scrape of footsteps outside, followed by what might have been a muffled sob. His father's pocket watch showed 8:42 in the beam of his flashlight. No one should be out in weather like this. He reached for the old Winchester hanging by the door. More habit than intention, then thought better of it. Instead, he grabbed the lantern and eased the barn door open against the wind. The beam of light caught her like a ghost. In the swirling snow, a woman heavily pregnant, her coat crusted with ice and her face pale with exhaustion. She squinted against the sudden light, one hand raised to shield her eyes, the other curved protectively around her swollen belly. "Please," she said, her voice barely carrying over the storm. "I just need somewhere to wait it out." Then her knees buckled, and Mason found himself moving forward without conscious thought, catching her before she could fall. She was lighter than she should have been, especially carrying a child. Up close, he could see how young she was, though her eyes held the kind of weariness that aged a person beyond their years. Those same eyes now watched him warily, like a wounded animal unsure whether help was really help. "Let's get you inside," he said, his voice gruff with disuse. When was the last time he'd spoken to another person? Tuesday, maybe, when Bill Henderson from the feed store had called about his overdue account. The woman tried to stand on her own, but swayed dangerously. Mason kept a steady hand under her elbow as he guided her toward the house. The wind tried to snatch his father's words from his memory. "A man's worth is in what he builds, what he maintains. But what about what he saves?" Inside the cabin, the warmth from the wood stove hit them like a wall. The woman's clothes were soaked through, and she was shivering violently. Mason led her to his father's old armchair near the fire. then went to the back room where he kept his mother's cedar chest. The scent of mothballs and memories wafted up as he lifted the lid. There it was, near the bottom, his grandmother's wool blanket, carefully preserved all these years. The wool was still soft, the pattern of running horses still clear in the faded blues and greys. His mother had wrapped him in this same blanket during storms like this, telling him stories about the wild mustangs that once roamed these hills. When he returned to the living room, the woman had her eyes closed, one hand still resting on her belly. She started at his approach, then stared at the blanket he offered as if it were made of gold. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers trembling, as they touched the wool. "I'm Sarah Mitchell." She hesitated, then added, "I was on my way to somewhere else when the storm caught me." Mason nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. People didn't end up on strange doorsteps in weather like this unless they were running from something or someone. He'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes the darkest storms weren't the ones that brought snow. "Mason Tucker," he replied, moving to stoke the fire. "You can stay until the storm passes." He didn't add that the forecast called for 3 days of heavy snow, one problem at a time. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and something in Mason's chest tightened at the gesture. It had been so long since these walls had sheltered anyone but himself, so long since he'd had to think about another person's comfort. "I don't want to be a burden," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Once the road clears, we'll figure it out then," Mason cut in, more sharply than he'd intended. He softened his tone. "You need to warm up first. When's the last time you ate?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. Mason went to the kitchen and put water on to boil. His cupboards were far from full, but he still had some of Mrs. Henderson's soup from when he'd helped fix her roof last month. The old woman was always trying to fatten him up, claiming he was too thin for winter. As he worked, he could hear Sarah's breathing evening out, the worst of her shivering subsiding. The blanket seemed to give her more than just warmth. There was comfort in it, the kind that came from being wrapped in something that had sheltered others before you. "The baby's moving," she said suddenly, her voice carrying from the other room. "I think he likes being warm again." Mason paused in his soup warming, struck by the simple trust in those words. He'd gone from being alone to being responsible, for 2 lives in the space of an hour. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a familiar load, not unlike the weight of his father's watch in his pocket. When he brought her the soup, Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, accepting the bowl carefully. "You don't know anything about me." Mason considered her question as he settled into the other chair, the one his father used to occupy. Through the window, he could see the storm raging, turning the world white and wild. Inside, the fire crackled, and the old wool blanket caught its light, the running horses seeming to move in the shadows. "My father used to say that a ranch was more than just land and livestock," he said finally. "It was a place where people could find shelter from whatever storm they were facing." He touched the pocket watch, feeling its familiar weight. "Besides, no one should be alone on a night like this." Sarah nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. Some decisions didn't need explaining, they just needed to be made. She sipped her soup slowly, the blanket tucked around her like a shield, while outside the wind continued to howl. They sat in companionable silence, 2 strangers brought together by circumstance and storm, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories. The wool blanket stretched between them like a bridge, its pattern of running horses a reminder of wild things tamed, of shelter offered and accepted. Neither of them knew it then, but that blanket would become more than just warmth on a cold night. It would become a symbol of their beginning, the first thread in a tapestry of shared moments that would eventually weave their separate lives into something new, something neither of them could have imagined on this storm-dark night. The storm raged for 3 days, piling snow against the cabin windows until the world outside became a blank canvas of white. Inside, Sarah's cough grew worse. Mason found himself listening for it in the night, each ragged breath making him think of his mother's final winter, when illness had taken root deep in her lungs. On the fourth morning he made the call he'd been dreading. The ancient rotary phone in the kitchen still worked, though the line crackled with static. "Doc Matthews, it's Mason Tucker. I've got a situation out here." The doctor's worn leather medical bag arrived with him an hour later, carried through the drifts by the same determination that had served the valley for 40 years. Harold Matthews stomped snow from his boots and set the bag on the kitchen table, its scuffed surface telling stories of countless house calls and midnight emergencies. "Well now," he said, studying Sarah where she sat wrapped in the wool blanket, "let's have a look at you and the little one." His voice carried the gentle authority of a man who had brought most of the county's children into the world. Mason moved to leave them alone, but Sarah's hand caught his sleeve. "Stay." The word was barely a whisper, but it rooted him in place. He nodded, settling into the chair beside her while Doc Matthews opened his bag. The brass clasps clicked open with familiar precision, revealing neat rows of instruments and bottles that seemed to belong to another era. The stethoscope came. First, its metal cold against Sarah's chest as the doctor listened to her breathing. "Bronchitis," he pronounced, "but nothing we can't handle." He pulled out a small brown bottle, measuring drops into a spoon with practiced ease. "This will help with the cough. Now let's check on that baby." From the depths of his bag came tools that had guided generations of new life into the world. A fetal heart monitor, blood pressure cuff, measuring tape. Each instrument emerged with the reverence of ritual, laying out a path from uncertainty to hope. Sarah answered the doctor's questions quietly. 7 months along, no previous complications, though her blood pressure had always run high. She didn't mention her journey through the storm or what had brought her to Mason's door. Some stories, Mason had learned, revealed themselves in their own time. "The baby's strong," Doc Matthews said finally, packing away his instruments. "But you need rest, proper meals, and no more wandering in snowstorms." His eyes met Mason's over Sarah's head, carrying a weight of unspoken meaning. Mason walked the doctor to the door, where the old man paused, one hand on his medical bag. "She's running from something, that one," he said softly. "Or someone. I know. The whole valley will be talking by sundown." Mason thought of Sarah's face when he'd offered her the blanket, the way trust and wariness had warred in her eyes. "Let them talk." Doc Matthews nodded, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You're your father's son, all right." He pressed a bottle of prenatal vitamins into Mason's hand. "Make sure she takes these. I'll be back in a week to check on them both." The medical bag swung at his side as he made his way back to his truck, leaving deep footprints in the snow. Mason watched until the taillights disappeared into the swirling white, then turned back to the warmth of the kitchen. Sarah had dozed off in the chair, one hand resting protectively over her belly, the other still gripping the edge of the wool blanket. The morning light caught the silver threading in the pattern, making the running horses shimmer like spirits. Mason moved quietly, fixing tea the way his mother had taught him, strong, with honey for healing. The familiar motions brought back memories of other winters, other sickbeds. His mother's voice seemed to whisper from the steam, "Sometimes healing needs more than medicine. Sometimes it needs time and a place to rest." When Sarah woke, he had soup warming on the stove, vegetable this time made from his own preserved garden stores. She accepted the tea with hands that shook less than before, her eyes clearer after the doctor's visit. "The whole town will know I'm here now," she said, her voice carrying an edge of fear. "This valley's good at keeping its own secrets," Mason replied, thinking of other strangers who had found refuge here over the years. His father had never turned away anyone in need, and the community had followed his lead. Sarah sipped her tea, considering his words. "I can't stay forever," she said finally. "Once the baby comes, we'll figure it out then." Mason cut in, the same words he'd used that first night. They felt different now, weighted with possibility rather than obligation. The cough medicine worked its magic through the day, easing the worst of Sarah's symptoms. By evening, she was strong enough to help Mason with the simple tasks of living, washing dishes, feeding the chickens in their coop just outside the kitchen door. Her hands were skilled, he noticed, used to work and responsibility. After dinner, they sat by the fire while Mason told her about the ranch, its history, its struggles, its stubborn refusal to fail completely. He found himself speaking of things he rarely shared. His father's battle with cancer, his mother's quiet strength, the weight of carrying their legacy alone. Sarah listened, her fingers tracing the pattern of horses in the wool blanket. "It's not just a ranch," she said softly. "It's a home." The word hung in the air between them, full of meaning neither was ready to examine too closely. Outside, the wind had finally died down, leaving a silence as deep as the snow that blanketed the valley. Doc Matthews' medical bag had left more than medicine behind. It had brought with it a sense of permanence, of decisions that would need to be made. But for now, in the quiet of the winter evening, they had this moment, two souls finding shelter in each other's company, while the world outside waited in its blanket of white. February arrived with another blizzard, this one fiercer than the last. The wind found every crack in the old cabin's walls, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Sarah's labor had started just after midnight, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Mason stood at the window, pressing his father's, watched to his ear as if its frozen hands could somehow speed Doc Matthews's arrival. The phone lines were down, but Martha Henderson had promised to fetch the doctor with her son's four-wheel drive. Now, watching the snow build in the yard, Mason wondered if even that would be enough. Sarah's cry from the bedroom pulled him back. To her side, she was propped up against his mother's pillows, her face pale but determined. On the bedside table lay a package that had arrived just days before, a handmade baby blanket, crafted by the women of the valley. Each square told a story. Lamb's wool from the Wilson farm, cotton from the Henderson's summer crop, even a patch of silk from Mrs. Matthews's wedding dress. "The community takes care of its own," Martha had said when she delivered it, her eyes twinkling with knowing wisdom. The blanket represented more than warmth. It was acceptance, protection, a promise that Sarah and her child would not face the future alone. Another contraction seized her, and Sarah grabbed Mason's hand. Her fingers were cold despite the fire's heat. "Talk to me," she gasped. "Distract me." So Mason told her about spring calving, about watching new life come into the world year after year. He described how the mothers knew just what to do, how even the smallest calves found their feet within hours. Sarah smiled despite her pain, understanding what he wasn't saying, that life knew its own way, that bodies held ancient wisdom. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows in their frames. Sarah's grip tightened as another contraction built, closer to the last. There was no holding back now. The baby was coming. Doctor or no doctor. "I'm scared," Sarah whispered in. A moment of respite. Mason squeezed her hand, thinking of all the strength he'd seen in her these past months. "You're not alone," he said simply, and saw something settle in her eyes at the words. The next hour passed in a blur of pain and purpose. Mason moved as if in a dream, following Sarah's instructions, fetching water, supporting her as she walked the room between contractions. The grandmother's wool blanket was draped across her shoulders like a shield, its running horses witnessing this new chapter of life. Just when the storm seemed to peak, headlights cut through the snow. Doc Matthews burst through the door in a swirl of wind and ice, his medical bag already open as Martha Henderson followed with clean towels and her own brand of calm efficiency. "Well now," the doctor said, taking in the scene, "looks like this little one's eager to join us." His presence filled the room with quiet confidence, his hands sure as they checked Sarah's progress. Martha took charge of the practical details. Water boiling, blankets warming by the fire, the 100 small tasks that ease the path of new life into the world. She hummed as she worked, an old hymn that seemed to calm both Sarah and the storm outside. The final moments came in a rush of effort and encouragement. Sarah's cry of triumph merged with a smaller, stronger sound, her son's first breath, his first protest at leaving the warm darkness for this bright, cold world. Doc Matthews worked quickly, checking the baby's health, while Martha cleaned and swaddled him in the community's blanket. The patchwork squares welcomed him, like the arms of every woman who had stitched their hopes into its making. "He's perfect," Martha announced, placing the bundle in Sarah's arms, strong as a winter colt. Sarah's tears fell on the blanket as she counted fingers and toes, memorizing her son's face. Mason stood back, watching mother and child find each other in those first precious moments. The scene stirred something deep in his chest, something he thought had frozen solid years ago. "Would you like to hold him?" Sarah's question caught him off guard. He started to refuse, but Martha was already moving forward, showing him how to support the baby's head, how to tuck him close against his chest. The weight of him was surprising, so small, yet somehow containing all the hope in the world. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but seeming to look straight through to Mason's soul. "James," Sarah said softly, "after your father, if." "That's all right." Mason looked up sharply, meeting her gaze. In it he saw everything they'd shared these past months, trust built slowly, understanding grown in silence, a future neither had planned but both now found themselves facing. Doc Matthews and Martha exchanged knowing looks as they packed up to leave. The storm had eased enough for safe travel, though the doctor promised to return the next day. Martha left detailed instructions for the night ahead, her practical concern masking deeper emotion. As the door closed behind them, the cabin settled into a new kind of quiet. Sarah dozed in the bed, one hand resting on the community blanket that wrapped her son. Mason sat in the rocking chair his father had made, watching over them both. In his pocket, the old pocket watch ticked on, marking time in a world that had shifted on its axis. Outside, the storm was passing, stars beginning to show through, breaks in the clouds. Inside, a new life had begun, wrapped in wool and cotton and silk, in stories and hopes and the strength of women who understood what it meant to begin again. Mason thought of his father's words about a man's worth being in what he builds, what he maintains. Looking at Sarah and James, he understood finally that sometimes what you build isn't made of wood or stone, but of moments like these, of trust given and received, of life continuing despite all odds, of love growing quiet and strong as a winter storm's passing. As winter's grip loosened on the valley, Sarah discovered the leather-bound ledger in Mason's desk drawer. Its pages told the story of the ranch's decline in columns of red ink and diminishing numbers. But Sarah had grown up on a farm in Minnesota, where her father had taught her that sometimes the best growth came from pruning back to essentials. "We're thinking too big," she said one evening, James sleeping peacefully in his cradle, while she and Mason sat at the kitchen table. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger, her handwriting neat and purposeful. "What if we started smaller, but smarter?" Mason watched as she outlined her vision. A market garden in the fallow field behind the barn, heritage chickens for specialty eggs, artisanal cheese from the small dairy herd. "The valley's changing," she explained. "People driving up from the city want something authentic, something with a story behind it." Her enthusiasm was infectious, though Mason's initial skepticism showed in the furrow of his brow. "It's not exactly ranching the way my father did it." "No," Sarah agreed, gentle but firm. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." She nodded toward his father's pocket watch, still keeping its silent time on the table between them. "Time moves forward, Mason. We either move with it or get left behind." The first seeds went into the ground as soon as the soil could be worked. Sarah had connections from her farming days, heirloom varieties that would command premium prices at farmers' markets. Mason found himself learning new rhythms, his cattle rancher's hands growing accustomed to the delicate work of transplanting seedlings. Young James spent his days in a makeshift sling on Sarah's back, gurgling at butterflies while she worked. The baby blanket from the valley, women now served as his playmat in the shade of the old apple trees, which Sarah insisted could be pruned back to productivity. Each evening, Sarah updated the ledger with meticulous care. Small victories were recorded in black ink. The first batch of eggs sold at Martha Henderson's church social, a contract with a farm-to-table restaurant in the nearby tourist town, advance orders for their planned cheese production. "See here," she said one night, showing Mason the neat columns. "We're not rich yet, but we're not bleeding money anymore either." Her finger traced the upward trend of their modest profits. "By summer, we might even have enough to fix the barn roof." Mason studied the numbers, remembering his father's lessons about a man's worth. But Sarah had taught him something new, that worth could be measured in more than just acres and head of cattle. It could be found in the way the land came back to life under careful tending, in the satisfaction of growing things that brought health and happiness to others. The ledger became their nightly ritual, a way of marking progress and planning dreams. Sarah's practical optimism balanced Mason's cautious nature, while his deep knowledge of the land helped shape her innovations. Together, they were writing a new story in those pages, one measured not just in dollars and cents, but in the sense of purpose that had returned to the old ranch. Spring moved towards summer, and the ledger filled with more black ink than red. But the true prophet, Mason, realized couldn't be recorded in any book. It was in the way Sarah's eyes lit up when she showed him the first tomato seedlings breaking ground, in James's delighted laugh when a mother hen paraded her chicks past his blanket, in the gradual easing of the weight he'd carried since his father's death. The ranch was changing, becoming something new while honoring what had come before. And in the ledger's pages, written between the lines of Sarah's careful accounting, was the story of three people learning that sometimes the best traditions were the ones you built together. The summer evenings stretched long and golden across the valley, painting the old ranch in honey-colored light that reminded Mason of his childhood. In his workshop behind the barn, he worked late into the twilight hours, his father's old woodworking. Tools scattered across the bench. Curls of pine shavings gathered at his feet as he carefully shaped what was becoming a small wooden horse. The craft had come back to him slowly, memories of watching his father work guiding his hands. The horse was taking shape just as he remembered the ones his father had made. Proud neck arched, mane flowing, legs caught in mid-gallop. He'd found the design sketched in the margins of his father's old account book, alongside notes about cattle prices and fence repairs. James was sitting up on his own now, bright eyes tracking everything around him. During the day, he watched the real horses in the pasture from his blanket, tiny hands reaching toward them while Sarah worked in the garden. Something about the boy's fascination with the animals had stirred Mason's memories of his own childhood toys. "Your grandpa would have loved you," Mason told James one evening, holding him on his hip while he worked. The baby reached for the wooden horse, still rough but recognizable. He made these for all the children in the valley, seemed to think every kid needed a horse of their own, even if it was just a wooden one. The workshop had become their special place in the quiet hours before sunset. Sarah didn't ask what they did out there. She just smiled when she saw the sawdust on Mason's clothes and the contentment in James's face. Sometimes Mason caught her watching them from the garden, her eyes soft with something that made his heart skip. The wooden horse took shape slowly, each detail carefully considered. Mason found himself talking as he worked, telling James stories about the ranch's history, about the real horses that had once filled the pastures, about his own father and the legacy he'd left behind. The baby might not understand the words, but he seemed to grasp their importance, his small face serious as he listened. "There now," Mason said one evening, holding up the finished piece. The horse gleamed golden in the setting sun, its surface smooth as silk from hours of careful sanding. He'd carved the date into the base, along with James's name and a tiny running horse that matched the pattern on his grandmother's wool blanket. James's eyes lit up at the sight of it, his small hands reaching with surprising gentleness. Mason watched as the baby explored his creation, tiny fingers finding every curve and angle. When James looked up at him and smiled, a real smile, full of recognition and joy, something shifted in Mason's chest. That night, after James was asleep in his crib, Mason found Sarah on the porch. She was updating the ledger in the last of the daylight, her neat columns now showing consistent black ink. The wooden horse sat on the rail beside her, its shadow long in the evening light. My father used to say that giving a child their first horse, even a wooden one, was a promise, Mason said quietly. A promise that they belonged somewhere, that they had a home. Sarah's hand stilled on the ledger. Is that what you're promising him? Both of you, Mason replied, the words coming easier than he'd expected. If you want it. Sarah set down her pen, her eyes meeting his with the same directness she'd shown that first storm-swept night. We do, she said simply. We have for a while now. The evening crickets began their chorus as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Inside, James slept peacefully, the wooden horse standing guard on his windowsill. In its carved lines were promises neither Mason nor Sarah needed to speak aloud, promises of family and belonging, of love given freely and received with grace. Mason's father's watch ticked softly in his pocket, marking time in a world that had grown fuller than he'd ever imagined possible. Summer stretched ahead of them, rich with promise, while the wooden horse watched over their growing family with its carved eyes, bearing witness to the quiet miracle of hearts finding their way home. The bank notice arrived on a crisp October morning, its official letterhead stark against the pile of bills on the kitchen table. Mason read it twice, his father's pocket watch heavy in his hand as he calculated the numbers in his head. 6 months to catch up on the back payments, or the bank would foreclose. All their summer progress, all Sarah's careful planning, threatened by years of debt he'd accrued before she arrived. He found her in the garden, James toddling between the autumn squash vines while she harvested the last of the heirloom tomatoes. The wooden horse was clutched in the boy's small fist, a constant companion now. Mason's throat tightened at the peaceful scene, knowing he was about to shatter it. The bank wants their money, he said simply, holding out the notice. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and took the paper, her expression growing serious as she read. Sit with me, she said, settling onto the old garden bench. James crawled into her lap, sensing the shift in mood. Show me the exact numbers. Mason pulled out the ledger they'd been keeping, its recent pages showing modest profits that suddenly seemed insufficient. Sarah studied both documents, her finger tracing the columns while she thought. We've been thinking too small, she said finally. These specialty crops, the artisanal cheese, they're good, steady income, but we need something bigger to clear this debt. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger, her handwriting quick. And sure, the valley's becoming known for authentic farm experiences. What if we opened the ranch to visitors, not just day trips, but real stays, people paying to learn traditional ranching skills, to disconnect from city life? Mason frowned. Turn the ranch into some kind of tourist attraction? No, Sarah said firmly. Turn it into a school, a place where people can learn the values your father taught you, the skills that built this valley. She bounced James gently as she continued. The old bunkhouse could be converted to guest rooms. We already have the knowledge. We just need to share it. Mason stood, pacing the garden path. The notice seemed to burn in his pocket next to his father's watch. It's not what this place was meant to be. Maybe it's exactly what it was meant to be. Sarah's voice was gentle but determined. Your father taught people, didn't he? Shared his knowledge with anyone who asked? The memory came unbidden, his father teaching young ranchers about cattle breeding, showing neighbors how to mend fences, passing on the wisdom of generations. The wooden horse in James's hands was testament to that sharing spirit. Sarah was still writing in the ledger, calculating costs and potential income. We could start small, just a few guests at a time. Martha Henderson's daughter works in marketing in the city. She's already offered to help promote our cheese. This would give her something bigger to work with." Mason sat back down, looking at her figures. The numbers were ambitious but not impossible. More importantly, he saw the vision behind them, a way to preserve the ranch's spirit while adapting to changing times. "We'd need help," he said, beginning to think it through. "Can't run cattle, grow crops, make cheese and teach people, all at once." Sarah smiled, seeing his reluctance soften. "The Wilson boys are looking for summer work. And remember that couple that bought our cheese at the farmer's market? The ones who kept asking about ranching? They're retiring from teaching and looking to learn the lifestyle." She reached for his hand, her fingers warm from the sun. "This isn't giving up the ranch, Mason. It's giving it new life, sharing it with people who want to learn what you know, what your father knew." James climbed from his mother's lap to Mason's, still clutching his wooden horse. The toy's carved eyes seemed to watch them, bearing witness to another moment of change. 6 months, Mason said, touching the bank notice in his pocket. "It's not much time." "It's enough," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "We've already done the hardest part, learning to adapt, to trust new ways of doing things." She nodded toward James. "He's going to need something to inherit, and maybe this is better than just land and buildings. A living legacy, teaching what really matters about this life." The autumn sun slanted low across the garden, gilding the squash vines and tomato plants. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, while closer to the barn, cheese aged in the cellar they'd converted over the summer. Each piece was part of the puzzle Sarah was proposing, not an ending, but a transformation. Mason pulled out his father's watch, its familiar weight now feeling less like a burden and more like an anchor, keeping him steady as they charted this new course. "All right," he said. "Show me your plan." The stack of gambling markers landed on the kitchen table like a handful of dead leaves, their edges worn and stained. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at her late husband's signature scrawled across each one, while across the table, Robert. Mitchell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Found these in Tommy's effects," he said, watching her carefully. "Seems my little brother left quite a debt behind. Casino's mighty interested in collecting, and since you're his widow..." Mason stood in the doorway, his shadow falling across the markers. James was asleep upstairs, his wooden horse standing guard on the windowsill. The autumn wind rattled the windows, carrying the first hint of winter's bite. "Your brother's dead," Mason said quietly, "and those markers died with him." Robert's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "That's not how inheritance law works, friend. Sarah here inherited everything, assets and debts alike." He pulled another paper from his jacket. "Casino's lawyers are quite clear on that point." Sarah's voice was steady when she spoke, though her fingers pressed white against the ledger she'd been updating before Robert's arrival. "We both know Tommy gambled away everything we had. There's nothing left to collect." "Nothing?" Robert's eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the fresh-painted walls, the new curtains Sarah had sewn herself. "Seems like you've landed on your feet just fine. Nice little setup here. Be a shame if legal troubles interfered with all this domestic bliss." Mason's hand moved to his pocket, touching his father's watch. The gesture caught Robert's attention. "That's a nice piece," he said. "Gold, isn't it? Might cover some of Tommy's markers. Family heirlooms have a way of settling family debts." Something cold settled in Mason's chest, but before he could speak, Sarah stood. She gathered the markers with steady hands, her eyes never leaving Robert's face. "You want to talk about family?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of winter frost. "Tommy wasn't just your brother. He was my husband, and James's father. He chose gambling over us, chose to drive off that cliff rather than face his debts. But he made one good choice at the end. He made sure these markers couldn't touch us." She pulled out the final letter Thomas had sent her, the one she'd torn up in the storm. She'd pieced it back together in the quiet hours after James's birth, knowing someday she might need it. "Read the last paragraph." Robert's eyes narrowed as he scanned the words. Mason moved closer, reading over his shoulder. "I've filed for bankruptcy. The lawyers say it'll protect you and the baby. Don't try to find me. By the time you read this, there won't be anything left to find." "Filed 3 days before he died," Sarah said quietly. "Everything went through the courts months ago. Those markers aren't worth the paper they're printed on, and you know it. You're just hoping I wouldn't know." The smile slipped from Robert's face, replaced by something uglier. "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing house out here with your rancher while my brother's barely cold in his grave? Your brother's been gone a lot longer than he's been dead," Mason said, his voice carrying the weight of authority his father had wielded so naturally. "I think it's time for you to leave." Robert stood slowly, gathering the useless markers. "This isn't over. Family's family, and sooner or later, blood tells." "You're right," Sarah replied, her hand finding Mason's. "Family is family. But we choose what that means. James will grow up knowing love, not fear, knowing the value of honest work, not easy money. That's the only inheritance that matters." They watched from the porch as Robert's car disappeared down the drive, dust settling in its wake. The autumn sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. From upstairs came the sound of James stirring from his nap, followed by his happy babble at finding his wooden horse still guarding his dreams. "He'll be back," Sarah said softly. Mason squeezed her hand. "Let him come. This ranch has weathered worse storms." He pulled out his father's watch, its gold warm from his pocket. "Some things can't be bought or gambled away. Some things just get stronger with time." Sarah leaned against him, her strength flowing into his. They stood together. As the day's last light faded, watching the shadows lengthen across the land they'd made their own. Inside, James called for them, his voice carrying the promise of tomorrow, while the wooden horse kept its carved eyes fixed on the future they were building, one day at a time. Martha Henderson spread the petition across the town hall's ancient oak table, its pages filled with signatures from nearly every family in the valley. The document had grown from a simple show of support into something more, a declaration of community values, a statement of what they stood for. 57 signatures, Martha announced, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "Every rancher, farmer, and business owner from here to Miller's Creek. We're all backing your idea for the ranch school, Sarah." Sarah stood at the front of the room. James balanced on her hip, his wooden horse clutched tight. The boy had his mother's eyes, everyone said, eyes that could see possibility where others saw problems. Mason watched from his place by the wall, his father's watch marking time in his pocket, as Sarah began to speak. "What we're proposing isn't just about saving one ranch," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong. "It's about preserving a way of life, adapting it for the future. Every signature here represents knowledge that shouldn't be lost, skills passed down through generations." Doc Matthews nodded from his seat. "My grandfather doctored both people and animals in this valley, always said healing was healing, whether it walked on 2 legs or 4. That's the kind of wisdom folks don't get from books." The petition circulated again as Sarah outlined their plans. Each page bore not just names, but offers of help. The Wilson boys pledging summer labor, Mrs. Matthews offering to teach traditional food preservation, old Bill Henderson promising to share his grandfather's techniques for predicting weather by the clouds. "We've already had inquiries," Sarah continued, pulling out their ledger. "City folks willing to pay good money to learn what we take for granted. But more than that, they want to understand this life, to connect with something real." Mason stepped forward then, adding his voice to hers. "My father used to say a ranch was more than land and livestock. It was a gathering place, a teaching place." He touched the watch in his pocket. "Time moves forward, but some things shouldn't be left behind." The meeting shifted into practical planning, the community doing what it had always done, coming together to build something larger than themselves. Martha's daughter Ellen, with her city marketing experience, sketched out promotional ideas. The high school shop teacher offered to help convert the bunkhouse. Farmers pledged excess produce. For the cooking classes, Sarah envisioned. But it was the petition's final page that moved Sarah most. There, beneath the signatures, someone had written a simple mission statement: the Tucker Ranch School of Traditional Arts and Agriculture, where the past shapes the future. As the meeting wound down, people lingered to share stories and suggestions. James dozed against Sarah's shoulder, his wooden horse dangling forgotten from one small hand. Mason watched them both, remembering his father's words about a man's worth being measured by what he builds and maintains. "Your father would be proud," Martha said softly, coming to stand beside him, "not just of the ranch, but of the family you've built." She nodded toward Sarah, who was deep in discussion with Ellen about website design. "Some folks spend their whole lives looking for where they belong. Others create belonging wherever they go. She's the second kind." The petition found a permanent home in the rancher's kitchen, its pages reminding them daily of the trust their community had placed in their vision. More than a list of names, it was a bridge between past and future, a testament to the power of people coming together to preserve what mattered most. That night, after James was asleep, Sarah and Mason sat on the porch, the autumn stars bright. Overhead, the petition lay between them, its pages rustling softly in the evening breeze. 57 signatures, Sarah mused. 57 families believing in this dream. Mason took her hand, feeling the strength that had carried her through. Storms both literal and metaphorical. "Not just believing in it," he said. "Helping to build it. That's what community means. Standing together, growing together." In the nursery above, James slept peacefully, his wooden horse standing guard. The future they were building would be his inheritance, not just a ranch, but a legacy of belonging, of wisdom shared and preserved, of community bonds stronger than blood. The old fence post stood at the northern corner of the ranch, its weathered surface marked with generations of notches. Mason's grandfather had started the tradition, one mark for each winter storm that tested the ranch's mettle. His father had continued it, and now Mason found himself standing before it in the growing dark, watching the sky turn the color of bruised steel. The weather service was calling it the storm of the century. Sarah had been monitoring the radio all morning, her face growing more serious with each update. Now she appeared beside him at the fence line, James bundled against her chest in his warmest clothes. "The Wilson boys got the last of the cattle into the sheltered pasture," she said, her breath frosting in the bitter air. "Ellen called from town. They're closing the highways. Said this might be worse than the blizzard of '82. Mason touched the highest notch on the post, carved by his father's hand. "That storm nearly broke us, lost a third of the herd, half the fences." He pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time against the gathering darkness. "We've got maybe 3 hours before it hits." Sarah's organizational skills had already kicked into high gear. The community petition had evolved into a network of support, and she'd spent the morning coordinating their neighbors' preparations. The old bunkhouse, newly renovated for the ranch school, would serve as an emergency shelter for anyone stranded by the storm. "Martha's bringing extra supplies from the store," Sarah continued, bouncing James gently as he fussed. "Doc Matthews is setting up in the bunkhouse in case anyone needs medical attention. The Henderson boys are bringing their snow equipment, said they'd help keep the access road clear as long as they can." Mason nodded, adding a fresh notch to the fence post. The knife slid easily through the aged wood, leaving a clean mark that would weather and darken with time. Above it, decades of similar marks told stories of storms weathered, challenges faced, a community pulling together. They worked through the afternoon, securing everything that could be secured. The wooden horse watched from James's playpen in the kitchen while they moved emergency supplies into the bunkhouse. Lanterns, blankets, medical supplies, enough food to last a week, if necessary. Sarah's ledger became a command center, tracking, resources and responsibilities with military precision. The first blast of wind hit just as darkness fell, rattling the windows and howling through the valley like a living thing. Mason thought of that night nearly 2 years ago when another storm had brought Sarah to his door. Now she moved through the house with quiet confidence, checking windows, stoking fires, preparing for whatever the night might bring. "Someone's coming!" she called from the kitchen window. Headlights cut through the swirling snow. The first of their neighbors. Seeking shelter, Mason opened the door to find Bill Henderson's grandson, Tommy, his truck loaded with firewood and supplies. "Grandpa sent me ahead," the boy explained, snow melting in his hair. "Said you might need an extra pair of hands before this gets bad." More headlights followed as the storm intensified. The bunkhouse filled with familiar faces. The Wilsons, the Matthews family, even old Mrs. Peterson from the farm down the valley. Each arrival brought what they could share: food, blankets, stories, strength. Sarah moved among them with natural grace, organizing sleeping arrangements, coordinating meals, ensuring everyone had what they needed. James was passed from loving arms to loving arms, the community's children playing together while their parents planned and prepared. Near midnight, Mason stepped onto the porch to check the storm's progress. The wind screamed past the buildings, driving snow horizontal, but the lights burned steady in both house and bunkhouse. Sarah joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Your father would be proud," she said softly. "The ranch is still what he wanted it to be, a shelter, a gathering place." Mason pulled out his watch, its gold case gleaming in the darkness. Inside the bunkhouse, he could hear voices raised in conversation and laughter, children's sleepy giggles, the sounds of community drawing together against the storm. "He used to say that the worst storms showed people's true nature," he replied. "Look what this one's showing us." The fence post stood somewhere out in the darkness, its new notch already filling with snow. But it wasn't just marking another storm now. It was recording a moment of transformation when Sarah's vision of the ranch's future proved its worth in the most fundamental way. They stood together, watching the storm rage while their extended family found warmth and safety behind the walls they'd strengthened together. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they were exactly what the ranch had always been meant to be: a light in the darkness, a refuge in the storm, a community bound by something stronger than blood or winter winds. The rescue rope lay coiled on the bunkhouse table, each section marked by distinct knots tied by different hands. Sarah had spent summers on her uncle's fishing boat, learning the intricate patterns that could mean the difference between life and death on rough waters. Now she moved along the rope, checking each knot, knowing they might need every inch of its strength before the night was through. The call had come through on the emergency radio just after midnight. The Miller family was stranded at their farm 3 miles north. Their generator failed, their barn roof threatening to collapse under the weight of snow. Their youngest, Amy, was running a fever that had Doc Matthews worried. "We need to reach them," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the murmur of concerned voices. "But we'll do it smart, or we don't do it at all." She pulled out her ledger, now serving as a tactical manual. "I need 3 teams." Mason watched as she took charge, her quiet authority drawing everyone's focus. The wooden horse sat on the table beside the rope, placed there by James before Martha Henderson had taken him upstairs to sleep. Its carved eyes seemed to watch the preparations with eternal patience. "Team 1. Mason and Bill Henderson, you'll take the lead with the snow equipment. Tom Wilson and his boys will handle Team 2 with supplies and medical gear. I'll lead. Team 3 with Doc Matthews will focus on the Millers themselves." She turned to the rope, demonstrating the knots they would use to stay connected. "Every 20 feet we add a knot. Every knot is a lifeline, a connection to the person behind and ahead of you. We move as one line, one team." Each volunteer added their knot to the rope, the different patterns forming a kind of story. Sailor's knots from Sarah, ranch hands' hitches from the Wilsons, climbers' loops from young Tommy Henderson who'd learned them in scout training. Mason added his father's special variation of the bowline, taught to him on this very ranch 20 years ago. The storm raged beyond the bunkhouse walls as they made final preparations. Mason pulled out his pocket watch one last time, its hands showing just past 1 in the morning. Sarah caught his eye across the room, and he saw in her face the same determination she'd shown that first night when she'd refused to let winter defeat her. "We've got maybe 4 hours before dawn," she said, checking her own knots. "That's our window. After that, the temperature drops another 10 degrees. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "Nobody plays hero out there. We move together, we work together, we come back together. Clear?" The response was unanimous, voices raised in agreement. This was what community meant. Not just sharing the good times, but facing the darkness side by side. They moved out into the storm like a single organism connected by the rope that bore all their knots. Sarah had positioned herself third in line, where she could coordinate both front and rear teams. The wind tried to snatch their words away, but the rope carried messages down the line through a system of tugs and pulls she'd taught them. Mason led the way with Bill Henderson, their powerful snowblower cutting a path through drifts that threatened to swallow them whole. The leather of his father's watch strap creaked with cold against his wrist, but its weight reminded him of other storms, other rescues, other nights when the ranch had served as a beacon of hope. The journey to the Miller farm became a battle of wills, their determination against nature's fury. Every step had to be earned, every foot of progress fought for. But the rope held, each knot a promise kept, each tug a reminder that they weren't fighting alone. They found the Millers huddled in their kitchen, little Amy burning with fever in her mother's arms. The barn roof had indeed begun to sag, but Tom Wilson's boys immediately set to work clearing it, while Doc Matthews tended to the sick child. Sarah coordinated the evacuation with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown at the ranch. Within an hour, the Millers were packed and ready, their essential belongings secured, their livestock moved to safer shelter. The rescue rope now guided 2 families back through the storm, its knots holding firm against the wind's attempts to scatter them. Dawn was breaking as they made the final approach to the ranch, the eastern sky lightening to the color of steel. The rope had picked up a coating of ice, each knot now glittering like a frozen star. But beneath the ice, the patterns remained. Sailor, rancher, scout, father, neighbor, friend, each one a testament to the bonds that held their community together. In the bunkhouse, Martha Henderson had hot coffee waiting. James, awake now, ran to Sarah with his wooden horse held high, his face glowing with the uncomplicated joy of seeing his mother return. Mason watched them embrace, thinking of his father's words about a man's worth being measured by what he builds and maintains. But Sarah had shown them all something more. That true worth lay not just in what you built, but in how you brought people together, how you turned individual knots into a lifeline strong enough to save not just a family, but a community's soul. The spring morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the newly washed windows of Mason's father's study. He sat at the old desk, a small wooden box open before him. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, his mother's engagement ring caught the light and held it, the modest diamond surrounded by a pattern of tiny carved roses. His father had sold 3 prized calves to buy this ring, back when the ranch was just beginning to prosper. Mason ran his finger along the band's worn edge, remembering how it had graced his mother's hand through 40 years of seasons, through birth and death, triumph and hardship. Outside, he could hear Sarah's voice carrying from the garden, where she was teaching James the names of the spring flowers pushing through the soil. The boy's wooden horse stood sentinel on the windowsill, its carved eyes watching as Mason lifted the ring from its resting place. "You'd approve, wouldn't you, Dad?" he murmured, touching the pocket watch that never left his side. The answer seemed to come in the way the morning light caught the diamond, sending tiny rainbows dancing across. the study walls. He found Sarah in the kitchen later, updating their ledger with figures from the ranch school's first spring session. The project had succeeded beyond their hopes. Every bed in the converted bunkhouse was booked through summer with eager students, wanting to learn traditional skills. The Henderson boys fixed the last of the storm damage to the north pasture fence, she was saying, not looking up from her neat columns of numbers. And Ellen called. She's got 3 more families interested in the June workshop on cheesemaking. Mason watched her work, seeing not just the capable woman who had helped save the ranch, but the tired stranger who had appeared at his door that winter night. The woman who had taught him that strength could be gentle, that love could grow quiet and steady as prairie grass. Sarah, something in his voice made her look up, her pencil stilling on the page. I've been thinking. That sounds serious. Her tone was light, but he caught the flash of uncertainty in her eyes, the same look she'd had when Robert had threatened their peace with Thomas's gambling markers. It is. Mason sat across from her, placing his father's watch on the table between them. My father used to say that time was something you filled, not just something that passed. He took a breath, reaching for the ring in his pocket. I'd like to fill my time with you, with both of you. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as he opened the wooden box. The ring caught the kitchen light just as it had in the study, but now its sparkle was reflected in the tears gathering in her eyes. Mason, her voice caught. I don't know if I can. You don't have to answer now, he said gently, but I want you to know. You and James, you're not just staying here anymore. You are here, you're home, if you want to be. From upstairs came the sound of James playing, his childish voice carrying fragments of the songs Martha Henderson had taught him. The wooden horse would be with him, as always, watching over his games and dreams. Sarah touched the ring with one careful finger tracing the pattern of roses. When Thomas died, she said slowly, I thought that was the end of believing in promises. But you, she looked up, meeting his eyes. You taught me that some promises don't need to be spoken. They just need to be lived day by day. She picked up his father's watch, turning it over in her hands. Your father's watch, your mother's ring. They're not just jewelry, are they? They're stories. Proof that love can last, that it can weather any storm, if it's built on truth. Mason waited, his heart beating steady and strong as a summer rain. Sarah looked at the ring again, then back at him, and he saw in her eyes the same quiet certainty she'd shown while leading them through the blizzard. Yes, she said simply. Yes to time filled together. Yes to more stories. Yes to home. The morning sun streamed through the windows, warming the watch, the ring, their clasped hands. Upstairs, James laughed at some private delight, while outside the spring wind carried the promise of growth, of new beginnings built on foundations as solid as love, as enduring as hope. The wedding quilt hung in the afternoon sunshine, its colors rich against the weathered wood of the barn. Each square told a story. Here was silk from Martha Henderson's dress, there a patch from the wool blanket that had warmed Sarah on her first night at the ranch. The women of the valley had worked through spring to create it, stitching memories and hopes into every careful seam. Sarah stood before it now, running her fingers over a square made from one of James's outgrown baby clothes. The wooden horse sat on a nearby hay bale, watching as Martha helped her with the final touches of her simple dress. The boy himself was with Mason and Doc Matthews, practicing his important role as ring-bearer. A proper ranch wedding, Martha said, adjusting Sarah's hair. Outside, under the sky that brings both storm and sunshine, she touched a patch in the quilt made from her daughter Ellen's graduation dress. Life's like this quilt, you know. All these pieces that don't seem to fit at first until time and love stitch them together into something beautiful. The summer breeze carried the scent of wild roses and fresh-cut hay, along with the sounds of the gathering community. The ranch school's first season had ended yesterday, but many of the students had stayed for the wedding, drawn by the authenticity of this celebration of ranch life. Mason's father's watch marked the moments until the ceremony, carried in Mason's pocket as he waited beneath the old cottonwood tree. The rescue rope from winter's storm had been cleaned and braided into an arch above him, its knots still telling the story of their community's strength. When Sarah appeared, walking toward him with James by her side, Mason felt time slow to a precious crawl. The boy carried both rings on a small cushion made from a patch of his grandmother's wool blanket, his face solemn with the responsibility. The wooden horse had been tucked carefully into his pocket, a familiar comfort in this moment of change. Doc Matthews led the ceremony, his words carrying the weight of someone who had known Mason since birth, who had helped bring James into the world. "Love on a ranch," he said, "is like the land itself, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh, but always true to its nature. It endures drought and flood, wild storms and quiet sunsets." The rings they exchanged were both old and new. His mother's engagement ring, now joined by simple bands that Mason had helped the Wilson boys forge in the ranch's workshop. As they spoke their vows, Sarah's fingers intertwined with Mason's, strong and sure as the knots that had held them together through the winter storm. "I take you," Sarah said softly, "not just as my husband, but as father to our son, as partner in all seasons." Her voice carried clear across the gathered crowd. "I promise to build with you, to grow with you, to fill time with you in all the ways that matter." Mason's response came from deep in his heart. "I take you as my wife, as mother to our son, as the miracle that saved not just the ranch, but my soul. I promise to shelter you, to support you, to love you through every storm and sunshine." James handed them the rings with careful dignity, then tucked himself against Sarah's side, one hand slipping into his pocket to touch his wooden horse. When Mason knelt to include him in their embrace, the boy's smile rivaled the summer sun. For brightness, the celebration that followed embodied everything the ranch had become: a gathering place, a teaching place, a home. Tables groaned with community offerings, music rose from impromptu bands, and stories flowed as freely as Martha's famous cider. The wedding quilt hung as a backdrop to it all, its patches glowing in the golden light of evening. As the sun set, Mason and Sarah stood together beneath the cottonwood tree, watching James dance with Martha to an old ranch waltz. The wooden horse peeked from his pocket, somehow looking as happy as its young owner. "Look," Sarah said softly, pointing to where the rescue rope arch caught the last rays of sun. The knots seemed to glow, each one a testament to the bonds that had brought them to this moment. Mason pulled out his father's watch, its gold case warm from his pocket. "Time to fill," he murmured, drawing her close. "Together," Sarah agreed, as the quilt behind them rippled gently in the summer breeze, its patches holding all their yesterdays while promising all their tomorrows. 10 years after the wedding, the family gathered in front of the renovated ranch house for a portrait. The photographer, one of their former students, positioned them carefully. Mason and Sarah on the porch swing, James tall and straight at 15 beside them, and 5-year-old Emma perched on her father's knee, her mother's eyes bright in her sun-browned face. The wooden horse sat on the rail beside them, its carved surface burnished by years of loving hands. James had formally passed it to his sister the previous Christmas, though he still smiled at the sight of her carrying it everywhere, just as he once had. Mason's father's watch rested in his vest pocket, still keeping its own kind of time. Sarah wore his mother's ring, its roses worn smooth by a decade of ranch work and family meals, bedtime stories, and early morning chores. The wedding quilt draped the swing behind them, its patches faded, but its stories intact. The ranch school had flourished beyond their dreams. The original bunkhouse had been joined by 2 more dormitories, and their courses in traditional ranching. Arts now had a waiting list 3 years long. The ledger Sarah still kept showed columns of steady black ink, recording not just profit but purpose, a legacy built on sharing knowledge, preserving skills, nurturing both land and people. "Hold. Still now," the photographer called, adjusting her lens. But just then, a meadowlark landed on the porch rail, and Emma's delighted laugh captured the true spirit of the moment. Joy unexpected, love uncontained, family unbound by blood, but bound by choice. The resulting portrait showed more than just four people on a porch. It showed the fruition of that long-ago winter night when a storm brought Sarah to Mason's door. It showed James, no longer just a promise beneath his mother's heart, but a young man with his father's quiet strength. It showed Emma, the surprise blessing of their third year of marriage, named for Mason's mother. But most of all, it showed the legacy they'd built together, not just in the prosperous ranch behind them or the thriving school it had become, but in the way they leaned into each other, in the mingled strength and tenderness of their smiles, in the depth of belonging that radiated from every face. The portrait would hang in the ranch house living room, opposite the now yellowed newspaper article about Mason taking in a pregnant widow. Two moments captured in time, bridged by years of love, work, and faith in each other. A testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as simple acts of kindness, and the strongest foundations are built one choice, one day, one heart at a time. The headline in the Sunday magazine spread read, "Tucker Ranch, Preserving the Heart of Western Heritage." Below it, a color photograph showed Sarah demonstrating traditional cheese-making to a group of eager students, while James helped Mason guide a young calf through its first rope training. Emma sat on the fence nearby, her wooden horse beside her, watching the lesson with bright interest. Sarah kept the article in the ledger, next to that first yellowed clipping about the widow taken in during a storm. The contrast between them told the story of their journey, from desperate survival to thriving purpose, from solitary struggle to community strength. The Tucker Ranch School, the article read, has become more than an educational institution. It's a living bridge between past and future. Under the guidance of Mason and Sarah Tucker, traditional ranching skills are not just preserved, but adapted for a changing world. Their innovative approach has inspired similar programs across 3 states, creating a network of knowledge sharing that's revitalizing rural communities. The piece went on to quote their students, a burned-out lawyer who found healing in working with horses, a young couple determined to save their family farm, a retired teacher discovering joy in traditional crafts. Each testimony echoed with the same theme, that the ranch had helped them find not just skills, but purpose. Martha Henderson, now proud grandmother to half the valley's children, had framed copies of both articles. "Full circle," she said, touching the newer one, from taking in strangers to teaching them how to create homes of their own. The success measured in the article's statistics, students taught, techniques preserved, communities influenced, mattered less to Mason and Sarah than the deeper impact they saw daily. In James's growing confidence as an instructor, in Emma's natural ability with frightened animals, in the way their family's story gave hope to others facing their own storms. Mason's father's watch and Sarah's first borrowed wool blanket were now displayed in the ranch museum, along with the rescue rope and wedding quilt, artifacts of a legacy still being written. But the wooden horse remained in daily use, passed between children who needed its quiet comfort, its carved eyes still watching over dreams being born. The article concluded, "In a world racing toward the future, the Tucker Ranch stands as proof that moving forward doesn't mean leaving the past behind. It means building bridges strong enough to carry both, just as a winter storm once built a bridge between 2 hearts, creating a miracle that continues to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond its fence lines." Mason sat at his father's old desk, the evening sun slanting through the study windows, just as it had on that first day he contemplated his mother's ring. The leather-bound journal before him was nearly full now, its pages containing 15 years of thoughts, dreams, and answered prayers. He dipped his pen and began to write. "Time isn't just something that passes," Dad always said. "It's something you fill." Looking back now, I understand what he meant. We fill it with choices that become moments, that become years, that become a life. 15 years ago, a storm brought Sarah to our door. I almost turned her away that night, almost let fear of change override the impulse to help. But something in her eyes, something in the way she protected her unborn child, spoke to everything you taught me about what matters most. Today, I watched James teaching a group of students about animal husbandry, his voice carrying the same quiet authority you once used. Emma was in the garden with Sarah, learning the secrets of herbs and healing that now draw people from across the country. The wooden horse stood guard over their work, as it has over so many moments of our lives. The miracle, I've realized, wasn't just that Sarah came to us that night. The miracle was that she showed me how to turn a ranch into a home, a stranger into family, and loss into legacy. Every time I check your watch, I'm reminded that the truest measure of time isn't in hours or years, but in love given and returned, in wisdom shared, in lives touched and changed. You once said a man's worth was in what he builds and maintains. Sarah taught me that sometimes the most important building isn't done with hammers and nails, but with patience and trust, with forgiveness and faith. We've built something here that's bigger than ourselves, a place where past and future meet, where traditions aren't just preserved, but given new life. The storm that brought her to us has become the blessing that sustained us. Every notch on the fence post, every patch in the wedding quilt, every knot in the rescue rope tells part of our story. But the real story, the one that matters most, is written in the lives we touch, in the knowledge we share, in the love that grows stronger. With each passing season, you were right, Dad, time isn't just something that passes, it's something you fill with miracles.